Well, let's hear it.
So the syllabus has like one extra discussion board, but you addressed that in your announcement.
I did? What did I say?
That we can choose which one we
Yes.
want to apply to.
Yes.
But then the multitasking one
Mm-hmm.
is on the syllabus. It says it's due next Tuesday, but
Okay.
then like I just assumed it was Tuesday because of the confusion. So what is it?
It says it's due next Tuesday?
Yeah.
We're like a week off. Blackboard skipped one.
The one in Blackboard skipped one?
Yeah, there's like one topic that's missing in Blackboard.
Would somebody do me a favor, anybody, after class today, sit down with me and help me fix this so that I stop, hurting myself? Somebody protect me from myself is what I'm saying. Yeah, so if you don't mind helping, or Alex, or both of you guys, that would be great.
So then nothing was due today, correct? According to
I don't know. Was anything due today? I made this. I made this before classes started.
Everything that's due today is what we already did.
Oh, okay. So we might be. So it sounds like nothing's due today.
So yeah, there were the two that you could choose from.
Oh, here we go.
the one that I didn't choose last time for today.
Okay, that's good.
But that puts me, I don't know, behind in
Oh.
Blackboard, but on time for the syllabus.
Awesome. Hold on.
We can do it after class too. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. So let me do this. Would you guys mind if we fix this after class and then got back to you with the final answer? Since I seem to be confused. Yeah. One of the things I create this all before classes start. But if I made a mistake before classes start, this just gets perpetuated. So would you help me after class figure this out? Okay, good. Great. Well, good. Besides that, which I don't want to hear, what else is going on? Any other issues, problems? Did anybody sign up for Sanjeev's study? Anybody sign up for Sanjeev's study? Okay. Oh, that's the other class. So don't sign up for Sanjeev's study then. Okay. Is there anything up here that I'm not confused about? Let's see. This evening, the Industry Advisory Board is meeting with students from HSE. I think UX students are probably invited to that too, but if not, if you guys didn't get an invitation, okay, good. We'll have these from time to time, and it's a pretty good group, actually. So come join us, and I think it's just going to be over in ISTB 3. Let's see. So that's about that. Today we're going to continue talking about sensation and perception, and I think we'll talk about it a little bit in relationship to visual displays and text and things like that. And just as a reminder, this is the thing you always have to keep in mind about sensation and perception, is we're taking stimuli, basically energy, that's happening in the environment that we perceive with our sensory abilities, our hearing and our vision and our proprioception, as Joe was saying the other day, etc. And we are converting that into neural energy, basically neural signals and so forth. So that is bottom-up processing. We're taking this really detailed stuff and we're making something out of it. Similarly, we have expectations, and we've got this great brain between our ears that we use every single day, and that imposes expectancies on what it is we see. And it's usually where those two things meet that perception happens. So perception is highly influenced not only by how good the stimulus is, but how good our expectations are, and as well how good the designer how well the designer meets our expectations. If they don't meet our expectations, that is, if we have a mental model, sort of a view of the world, expectancies that are quite different than what the designer provides us, we're kind of out of luck when it comes to design. So that's the difference between bottom-up and top-down processing and why we have to design for each. These are in Blackboard, by the way, if you care to follow along. And to some degree, one of the things that you're sort of doing is, with this top-down processing, is you're helping provide the best guesses and context for people. So the best guess for example, where to look when they need to find a piece of information, what things go together, etc. We talked a little bit about some things related to top or bottom up processing, like color. And this is not working. Oh, there it is. One of the things we need to think about when we think about colors is that something like 9% of the male population is colorblind. And as a result, using color is kind of our one thing, our primary cue that we discriminate on between two pieces of information is not a good idea. Because at least 10% or 5% of your total population won't be able to discriminate it very well. So this gives an example of what this thing looks like if you have three types of color blindness. So you can see this doesn't vary much, right? If you are colorblind, you can still see black pretty well. But on the other hand, orange starts to get faded out in certain situations, so much so that under this actual situation, it actually looks a little rosish. The same thing with blue. It starts looking a little purple in some situations, etc. But let's talk about how to design things so that it's easy for people to sort of detect them and read them, the bottom-up part of this. When I first got to HP, one of the big questions that I got, and I can't remember why it was such a big deal then. I think we were trying to miniaturize a lot of devices and so forth. So people would always ask me, Russ, how big should the text be for a non-product thing, or sometimes even instructions for use, like directions, sometimes online. And my answer always was, it depends. One of the things it depended on, in fact, maybe the major thing it depended on, was contrast. And these guys had a habit back then of using black text on this gray background. And they thought, well, it soothes the eyes, right? It doesn't seem so stark. So as a result, that'll make people's eyes relax and that'll be friendly. And what was really happening, and it was pretty clear from the usability testing, that there just wasn't enough contrast for people to really see what was going on in the foreground and what was going on in the background. So as a result, it was having just the opposite effect. People had to really squint and had to work really hard in order to discriminate those two things and read it. So this is what contrast is. Contrast is just the difference between the foreground and the background. That's really, and it's the difference in terms of luminance. So if you think about it as kind of an equation, this is the luminance of the light area minus the luminance of the dark area divided by the sum of those two things. So as you see, if you increase the luminance of the light area, you get more contrast. If you, well, anyway, so this is kind of the idea. So this would be an example of really effective contrast, right? It's washed out a little bit when we project it here. This is not great, and then this is downright ineffective. One of the concerns I have, actually, and I see it all the time in graphic design, and I sort of understand why, but it still drives me crazy, is every graphic designer lots of graphic designers who I hire will end up using this pretty light gray text on a white background. And again, it's this notion that it's soothing, and in fact, it looks good. But if you do any amount of work on it for any period of time, it just isn't enough contrast to make the difference. And I think their point is an aesthetic one, which is, boy, it feels more soothing to people. It doesn't feel so stark and so forth. So somehow, because humans are multivariate, right, we have to figure out, okay, what's the right mixture? What's the right sort of trade-off between something you can see really, really well and something that doesn't appear stark and harsh. And that's going to vary a little bit depending on the application. For something at General Dynamics where there's, it could be weapon systems or defense systems or any kinds of other things, maybe stark isn't such a bad thing. If you're trying to design a piece of software for people to do their taxes and they're already nervous, maybe a little bit of softening isn't a bad idea. Go ahead.
I was just curious because that little, the text on the bottom there says maximize contrast with black letters on white background.
Yep.
Is it different for white letters on black background? I can just say that.
It is. So reversed polarity, they call it, isn't as easy to see or read as black letters on a white background. Go ahead.
Why is that? Because in that photo, it seems like the difference would be about the same anyway.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the difference is or why that is, but if you actually sort of run studies to see how quickly people read and kind of their comprehension afterwards, it turns out that black on white background works better.
Is that a learned behavior, or is that just how we process?
It seems to be how we process things. It's hard to tease out if it's learned or not because we usually have, black on white. And the reason we have black on white really was originally just kind of a cost decision, right? It was more likely to have bleached white paper, and you were putting ink on that paper, so the ink was the expensive thing. So you wanted as little of that as possible, so it was black on white. Yep. Yeah, but this looks like pretty good contrast here, right? But if we took that, and this is kind of a gray background here. This really ought to be black. So you know why it's not black? You know why it's gray instead? My graphic designer did this for me. who absolutely is a great graphic designer, by the way. But we had this conversation, this argument, time and time again. But and this is the thing to remember, she controlled the document. She controlled the prototype. So she put in what she wanted to put in. But this is a really important thing when it comes to things like prototyping. Remember that whoever holds the prototype is the person who is the most powerful on that team. So even their bosses and their bosses' bosses and all that kind of stuff, they'll tell them what to do. But the person actually controlling it, the person who actually has the prototype is in the driver's seat. Yep.
I was just thinking of the black on white background would
Yep.
probably reflect more photons from a scientific standpoint than the black would absorb them. So you'd have a greater.
Oh, that's interesting. So there's more brightness in general. Yep. I like that. Yep. And it's probably the case that this is, you could look this up somewhere. I just don't, but that's a great point.
Because if there's more dark area than the denominator, they would be smaller, right?
Yep. Yes, that's exactly right. Yep. So contrast is critical. The other thing that ends up being critical when we think about what makes text legible is it varies a little bit. And I'm sticking with this. This may change over time as displays get better and better. But it's still not quite the case that, well, I'll get into that in a minute. There's sort of two general families of typography. There's serifed fonts and there's sans serif fonts. And here is a sans serif font, and you can sort of tell the difference. The sans serif font doesn't have any of this embellishments, any of these hats or feet or anything that go on the text. And what ends up happening is on print, you actually have pretty darn good resolution of your typography. So as a result, you can see a lot more detail in print. Whereas on screen, this kind of stuff ends up not being, the resolution isn't as good, and this kind of thing isn't discriminated as well. So as a result, if you're designing for on-screen and you really care about legibility, typically you will use a sans serif font. If you're designing for paper, you typically use a serif font. Yep.
Is there any reason why sans serif font would be good for print?
Any reason why sans serif font wouldn't be good for print? Not necessarily, no. It's more just the opposite, that serif font would be bad often for electronic. Yeah. The other thing that serif font gets you, though, is it does give you a little bit more discrimination. So here there are more features different from letter to letter than there are here. Because it has these other little components to it, you can sort of, there's more to discriminate between an A and a B and a C and so on. Yep,
I
Annika?
was taught in typography class that the serifs pull the eye along when you're reading on print, although recent studies are starting to show that that's maybe
Yeah.
not the case. Even
Yeah.
though that's what we've been saying for decades.
So I always am skeptical, but I'm not an expert on this particular area. I'm always skeptical when people say, well, it pulls your eye along or it makes your eye move to the right. And I'm going, how the hell does it do that? You know what I mean?
It gives you something to follow.
Yeah. So I'm always skeptical about that, but it is a phrase. It's probably just something I don't understand. It's a phrase that artists use. My wife uses it. Oh, well, that pulls that in. And there's something to it. I'm just thinking from a psychologist standpoint, I don't know what that means. I'm just not quite sure. So it doesn't mean it's not true. It just means it doesn't fit into my way of thinking about the world. So this is the idea, at least until displays get much, much better, and they're on their way, continue to use a sans serif font like this without the little feet and the hats and so forth for online or for basically electronic display, and it makes sense to continue to use serif fonts for text in paper. Yes, ma'am.
Is this somehow related to additive and subtractive color?
Not this part, no. It's more the notion that it's the same reason that you don't use all capital text. So if you use all capital text, let's say I did this. That might be harder to discriminate than this. And one of the reasons is that these letters are much more similar to each other in terms of their shape than these are. So for example, you'll notice that some of these things happen above sort of this midline. Some of the letters happen below this midline. The same thing here. Some parts rise, some parts descend. And I think that's the same because there is more sort of variability here. It makes it easier to recognize one thing from the other. That's the same thing here. Because there's more variability between letters and so forth from one to the other, they're easier to recognize.
In that case, why not make web also used in serif fonts?
Normally, we would if the resolution of web was good enough. So the problem is the resolution on a computer screen, you can't count on being really high resolution. So as a result, sometimes these little embellishments end up looking more fuzzy than anything else.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Yes.
So is this true for print or just on the web with the capital letters?
This is true both.
So that's kind of interesting because I work for a fire
Yep.
security and dispatch center.
Yep.
And I'm just a call taker, so I type up.
Yep.
And they want us to use capital letters all the time because they feel like it's more distinguishable. rather than typing in lowercase.
Are you typing full strings of text?
No, just like notes. So like hot work permit. He'll be in this building.
Oh no, you want mixed case.
Yeah.
Tell them to stop that immediately. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's always issues because they're just like, well, what is this? You know,
Right.
do you mean this? Like there are always issues with it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So if possible, use mixed case.
Okay, I'm gonna bring it up to
Please do.
because ever since we've been talking about this, it's kind of like been
Right.
in the back of my head. Like,
Yeah. Well, in fact, we could do a little experiment if you wanted. I
Yeah?
mean, just do a little reaction time experiment to show one's better than the other or something of that sort.
Mhm. Okay.
Pretty easy to do, and it would be a replication. I mean, which is great actually. So doing replications, I think somebody mentioned it yesterday. I think maybe Robert mentioned it yesterday during his talk, and he sort of reminded me, yeah, how come we're not doing more replications? So replicating experiments are a good idea.
Okay.
Good.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, did somebody else have a question? Yeah.
Yes, so how
Rachel.
might various languages impact this?
Good question. I think so. I think things like this will still be the case. Capital will, all caps will be worse than mixed caps. Where I start getting confused is when we start talking about Chinese and things like that, because I simply don't know the language. But can you give me more detail about your question?
Mostly just with that, I'm just
Yeah.
curious because, everything we learn obviously is going to
Is
be
English.
And
Yeah.
I'm wondering if this principle holds true in languages, especially ones that have different structures,
Yeah.
syntax, alphabets, all that stuff, and if that would hold true for all of those languages, or if that might bring in opposing principles.
Yep. So I think, I'm pretty darn sure actually, that it holds for other languages. And the reason it holds is what this notion of orthographic similarity. So orthographic just means shape, okay? And the idea is that there's more differences in shapes with the mixed case than there are with the all caps. So that will be true in pretty much any language where they have things like capitals and mixed case. Yep.
Are there studies of cursive versus print?
There have been, and print is a lot easier to read. Cursive's faster to write. But those are the main differences. Yeah. Yes, Alex?
So for the web and for the print,
Yes.
so a lot of the times I feel like our resumes are online, and
Ugh,
sometimes we send
right.
them out to people through the web, but then if we go to like a conference, we print them.
Yep.
So which text is better?
Oh boy.
Two copies, two different fonts.
Yeah, I mean, one possibility is to have two copies in two different fonts, which is a lot of work.
Also, a lot of times we send it to a company, they'll look at it on the computer screen, and then they'll print it out, so it's the same.
So it's
Yeah.
right.
Make it big enough that it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I like that. I was gonna, yeah.
But if you make
So
it
if you make-
doesn't matter, then you have to fit it all in,
One page,
one
and that's
page,
like
so that kind of
impossible.
screws you up too.
Yeah, so this is getting a little far afield from what we were going to cover. However, I will say one other thing. Don't feel like you need to limit your resume to one page. Really, yeah, I think you do well. I would like to ask other people's opinions in here, who especially who are working and so forth. But my opinion is, especially if you're pursuing a master's degree and so forth, it's much more similar to a curriculum vitae than it is to a resume. You guys have done, you paid your dues, you're working hard, and you've done enough stuff to have it on a couple pages if you need it, sure. Okay, now, opposing views. Or, go ahead.
Yeah, so the biggest lie they tell you in undergrad
Yep.
from grad school is keep your resume to one page.
That's what, see, good. Why do they do that? It's ridiculous.
I've heard like you have to limit it to one page.
Right,
But if you're involved,
yeah,
you need to break that rule.
I'm with you. Okay, good. Yep,
I think online portfolio has become very popular, especially design in this field, whatever else. So it's like
I agree.
It's almost kind of like that summary piece.
Yes.
And they're drawn to this external fleshed out.
So that's another possibility, right? You could do one page with, a very prominent link to your portfolio. But besides that, I would not knock yourself out to keep it to one page. In fact, you've got more to talk about than that. Yep.
My
Go ahead.
opposing view was kind of tying off of what he just said. I think it really just depends on what exactly the employer is asking for as a whole.
Yep.
So if they are just asking for a resume, then yes, I would say probably do more than one page. But if they're asking for a like resume cover letter where you have an opportunity to expand upon your resume and the
Yep.
things you've done, and like the millions of other things they'll ask for because they're an intense application process,
Yep.
then then maybe stick to one page and use your cover letter as that opportunity. So I guess it's situational.
Situational. Okay.
I think
Sarah?
it really depends on how much experience you have and
Right.
if that experience applies to the job you're applying for. So if it's relevant, then and you have like 10 plus years of experience, then why
Yeah.
wouldn't you include that on your resume? It's not going to fall within one page if that's like 10 years. of experience,
Exactly.
Unless you've worked in only one job.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's the idea. Don't try to fool people by having more, indicating that you have more experience than you do. But I think it's perfectly appropriate for it to be longer. Yeah, Taylor.
I was just going to say I had a technical writing instructor actually who was a hiring consultant
Yep.
on the side as well. And she kind of put me on the one-page resume, not necessarily keep it to one page, but keep everything that you really want them to see on that first page. So she said that from her experience hiring, especially for jobs that had a lot of applicants,
Yeah.
they never would get past the first page. Looking at them.
Interesting. Yep.
Yeah, I think that's along the lines of what I've heard as well. Is that the point of the one page rule is that a lot of if you've got a manager that's going through hundreds and hundreds of them, you want to be able to catch their eye
Yeah.
in that first glance. But I think it also depends on the role, because if you're applying to a role that's really specialized and you want to really prove that you have the experience and the background to do well in that role, then you have a lot to offer. But if it's something that there's going to be hundreds of people, then you do need to stand out.
Yep. This is an interesting question. So I'll let you know where I stand. I think you do know. Do not my sense. So this doesn't mean you have to do it. But somebody who's been a hiring manager lots and lots of times, I'd much prefer to know what you've done, and if that requires more pages, that's fine by me. But yeah, it's interesting. It's really weird that there would still be this debate going on. And apparently we haven't solved it, because I don't know that I'm right on this. It's just kind of my sense. I do have a preference, yeah. Okay, so here's typography, and this is exactly what we were talking about. So using mixed case is really helpful for improving reading speed. So you can see things like just the variance here in the different types of characters. So this makes it easier to see. So you can see here's sort of the baseline. Here's what's called the, what is this called? The top part, etc. And that some parts are above the baseline, or quite a bit above the baseline, and then some parts are just halfway. Some parts descend, etc. So you can see that there's lots of sort of variance in this. And if this said typograph, but it was all caps, they would all start here and end here. So there's just a lot more variance. Here's some other interesting things in choosing fonts. And that is, certain things make fonts easier to read than others. So the width to the height ratio. So sort of the width of this to the height of this. Wider tends to be better up to the point, up to a certain limit of height. So basically, you tend to make this bolder, you can see it from farther away, is really what that amounts to. Symbol spacing, the horizontal space between characters, that amount of space. So the space between characters divided by the symbol height. So more space up to the limit of 0.25 to 1. So basically 0.25 to 1 actually makes this more readable. The stroke width, the print shouldn't be too fine, so making this bolder tends to make it easier to read. So one of the things, I think the idea here is that you know that you can play with these different things. There's not a particular formula necessarily, but if you want to make something from farther away, you want to make it readable from farther away for some reason, signage for example, then you can do a few things. You can make it wider, you can put more space between the symbols, and you can increase the stroke width. So I'm not going to worry about this too much, but go ahead.
So we keep talking about all caps versus mixed
Yep.
case. What about lowercase?
Lowercase actually falls somewhere in between these two things in terms of variability. There's still more variability in lowercase. So for example, you still have descenders, like a lowercase g, they have a descender that drops below.
So it's the mixture of the heights.
And the mixture really, absolutely, yep.
Okay.
Yep. And I'm not going to talk too much about these things. However, I think I'm going to, I'm not going to worry about that too much. We did talk about this. Well, let's talk about this. I think this is better in terms of thinking about principles. So I got a chance to meet somebody who I liked quite a bit some years ago, a guy named Ed Tufte. And Ed was, I don't know if he still is, a professor of graphic design at Yale. And he wrote some very good books on data visualization. And his specialty was how to visualize lots and lots and lots of data all in one place so that it makes some sense. If you ever get a chance to pick up any of his books or check them out at the library, they're worth getting. I'll have to think about the names of them, but his last name is Tufte, T-U-F-T-E. One is something like visualizing information, etc. But they're very visual, as you'd imagine, from a good designer, and very smart. And one of the ways he describes, really complains about a lot of our designs, is that they're too darn complex, much more complex than they need to be. And he uses this sort of rule of thumb called the data to ink ratio. And the notion is, in the old days when you were selling newspapers all the time, the most expensive thing on the newspaper was all the ink. The ink cost a lot of money. The paper wasn't too bad, believe it or not. So it became really important to get as much information across as you could without using too much ink, so you didn't run out of money, basically. So he defined two types of ink. One was called data ink, which was really important to present the data. And then the other stuff he called non-data ink. So this would be redundant information. It would be information used to elaborate or decorate or things like that. And he said, really, what ends up happening is if you use mostly data ink and hardly any non-data ink, you save a lot of money. Well, it turns out there's another happy coincidence. If you use mostly data ink and no non-data ink, it also makes it a lot easier to read. Not only that, it looks easier to read, it's less confusing, and it looks more professional. So one of the examples was, and we'll just do it with this, here's an example of a graph. And this graph is not ideal. So it has some data ink and some non-data ink. So the non-data ink is stuff we can get rid of. What can we get rid of on this graph yet not lose any meaning? The color? Yeah, I mean, we don't need yellow here for some reason. Usually you would use yellow if you wanted to compare one thing to another, for example. You'd have two different colors. So we could get rid of that.
You could get rid of the lines and percentages.
Yeah, these lines don't necessarily need to be here, right? And the percentages, let's see, it already says percentage of adults, so that could be 10, 20, etc. Oh, and these percentages.
Yeah.
Yep. You can get rid of, so that's 3 or 4 things right off the bat. What else?
Maybe thin the border around the entire graph a little bit.
Yep, we could thin that. Does there need to be a border?
It depends on the context.
Yeah, right, exactly. So there might not even need to be a border, but if not, we could certainly thin it. Yep.
The fact that the title says 1974 to 94 when it's already...
It's down here already. Yep, so we could probably get rid of this. What else? Anything else?
Percentage of adults is said twice. You only need it once.
Here's percentage. Yep, and here's percentage. Yep. So there's an awful lot of things you can do here, but one of the things you'll notice, and I've seen this with Excel, their default for making charts in Excel sometimes is more similar to this than to the opposite. So when you make a chart in Excel, it often has these flourishes that you probably don't need. For example, it'll make it look like it's in 3D for some reason, right? It doesn't need to be in 3D. I mean, that's pure decoration. So there are a lot of things like that that we can just get rid of. And often you can think about your designs this way, not just graphs, but I mean, think about the designs of your screens and so forth as keeping just the data ink and removing all the non-data ink. Yep.
So I would argue that some non-data ink is helpful. So like we can say that most of the title is redundant, but most people don't want to have to look at both the axes and what the units are to be able to understand the graph.
Yep.
So keeping that in the title
Yep.
will help you just at a glance.
Might not be the worst thing. Yep. Well, and I think that it's very similar to this. So I've decided that all design is an exercise in trade-offs. And it's just like this stark contrast, black on white versus a little lighter contrast, gray on white, where you're trying to decide, okay, do I want to go really hardcore here, or do I want to soften it up? And in your case, do I want to provide a little bit more information, or do I want to be, really stark? And it varies. Yep. So it's interesting. Even these rules, there's always variations. Yeah. So I think the idea here is, and the way I usually describe this is, it's trying to keep in the spirit of the design. And sometimes I'll go, really all the way, kind of follow every principle possible, and then start backing off a little bit, just to kind of capture the spirit of the design a little bit. Okay, so here's another part. It's the notion of screen density. So you've seen screens that just have way too much information on them, probably. It turns out we can calculate basically the amount of information on a screen by looking at the percentage of available characters that are being used. So if we have a screen that, sorry, I'm going to erase you, Matt. If we have a screen that looks like this with lots and lots of stuff, and this is actually better than some you'd see. Let's pretend it looked something like that, right? That's a pretty dense screen. There's an awful lot of stuff on this screen, and as a result, it can take a little while to see what you're looking for. I was going to say that this is actually better because at least it takes these things and puts them in 3 columns, which I sort of did automatically, but that doesn't always happen. So this notion is screen density. So you could imagine removing some of these things and the density is less, right? So now we moved that, so that's not as dense. That's basically what we mean by screen density. The more dense a screen is, the longer typically it takes to find the target, the particular thing you're looking for. Not surprising. Further, we can look at local density. So imagine I had just all kinds of things right in here. That doesn't make the overall screen a lot denser, but this one area here, this local area, is really dense, and it makes it difficult to find things within that area. So generally, the more dense a screen, the more time it takes to find things. On the other hand, you can do some very simple things that get around this problem. And those simple things are grouping, really. our mind tends to group stuff automatically. So sometimes, and I talked about this in our lab meeting yesterday, sometimes they group things for not better, and sometimes they group things for the better. So for example, if I want to say, oh, here's my McDonald's menu, and I've got all my burgers here, and all my fries and things like that, so fries and onion rings and things like that here. And I've got all my salads over here. And then I've got all my drinks over here, but they're divided into soft drinks and shakes. You can start to see that these are actually pretty easy to locate. So you might take the same overall screen density, but by grouping things, you end up with things that are easier to find. So people automatically group things. We have no choice. But this grouping is going to be really important. It's also the case that the better your grouping follows a predictable scheme, the better off it is people will be able to find things. So for example, the fact that this is burgers and these are, fries or fried stuff and these are salads, etc., you automatically know where to go pretty quickly. So you've reduced the complexity by grouping these things. Now, here is another thing that people will argue with me about. Let me tell you about one other thing. Imagine you have a form, and your form to fill out, so it could be any number of things. Your form could be something like, oh, I don't know, your first name, last, let's put in credit card number and date and something else, okay? And then these are the lines. That's one way to do it, right? Or you could have your lines and have first, last, oh gosh, credit card, date, something else, something else. So you'll notice the difference in alignment here. This is left aligned. This is ragged, or it's actually, yeah, it's kind of ragged aligned. So you can see that difference. It actually turns out that people are faster at reading this than they are at reading this. One of the reasons, and maybe this relates to following your eyes, one of the reasons is when people, I talked about having predictable areas. When people are reading things like this, they always know they're coming back to this same spot. Whereas here, they don't know they're coming back to the same spot. So that's what the data suggests. Now, sometimes there are problems with this. So for example, let's imagine I had so let's imagine this now said credit card. And it didn't start until here. There's some difference there, for example. But in terms of data, this ends up being faster to read than that. Go ahead, you had a question.
Well, I was just going to say that in the context of filling out a form, is the speed of reading the labels really what's important? You're going to have interruptions anyway to go fill out each form, each part.
Right. No, it's not so much that speed's important. Speed serves as a proxy. It serves as a measure of cognitive workload. So typically, the harder you're working cognitively, the longer it takes you to do a task. So it's not so important that we save the extra half second. It's so important that that extra half second tells us that our mind had to go through more operations. And if our mind has to go through more operations, then that makes it more difficult. And if the number of those operations add up, it tends to have kind of a cumulative effect. Yeah. So, and I think that that's the issue. I think people often have that, and I've had to just explain that to reviewers when I've published papers and so forth. I'm not so interested in saving the extra half second. I'm interested in what that extra half second tells us. And what it tells us is, actually, you know what? During that extra half second, your mind had to do something else. Yep. Okay, now, we'll talk a little bit about sometimes you want to make things really pop out. So for example, if you are involved in marketing and need to sell stuff, or donations, for example, you need to make things conspicuous. You make things really obvious. So this is conspicuity, and it's when it's crucial for people to notice things. So let's start with let's start with the least egregious first. People will notice things, and they have no choice but to notice things if it's different than all their surroundings. It's as simple as that. Typically, people notice stuff when it's different from whatever's in the background. So you can see here's a lot of nice grayscale stuff going on here, a couple little, color pieces up here. But now if you add in this big red thing, even though it has all caps, this big red thing here in the middle, people are drawn to it immediately. It can be different because it's bright, it can be different because it's a different color, or it can be different because it has lots of contrast compared to this, for example. Here's another example. You've seen this on your Mac probably. This Genie effect. When you click on something, we really want feedback that it's actually been clicked on and something is happening. The Genie effect is this notion where it sort of pops up and down. And that way you see it moving. That's kind of a way, it's a very conspicuous kind of thing. But you'll notice in their design, they did some trade-offs. It doesn't bounce up and down and get big or things like that. It's somehow still subtle, but draws your attention. Then, this is the tough one. Anything that's flashing or moving when you're looking at your computer, for example, or at a user interface, will definitely attract your attention. You have no choice but to pay attention to it, and we call it an obligatory cue. So you can imagine, back in ancient times, if something was moving in our visual periphery while we were off gathering berries or something of that sort, it was really important to pay attention to that thing. Because it could be food, or it could be trying to make us food. Make food us, well, you know what I mean. They're not making us food, they're trying to eat us. Okay. So this movement in the visual periphery is really important, and that's exactly what blinking simulates. So if you have something blinking, I dare you not to try to look at it. I mean, you will just, you can't help yourself. You look at it all the time, and it will drive you crazy. I apologize for people who've heard this story before. I did a bunch of work for Microsoft years ago. And Microsoft used to have this thing called Clippy. I don't know if you're familiar with Clippy. I hate Clippy. Clippy is awful. I was working on a product called, Encarta World Atlas. So it was an online atlas as well, quite a long time ago. I'm sure it's still online now. But they got all excited about things like Clippy. They actually called them interactive agents. And the idea behind these guys, we had a guy called, he was like Worldy or something, because it was an atlas. and it was these little skinny legs, and then he looked like a world, looked like a globe, and he had little skinny arms. And if he thought you were confused or didn't know what to do next, he would kind of interact with you. So let's imagine you were looking at something. Let's imagine you had a report and you needed to understand what's the gross domestic product of Kenya, for example. And you're reading and so forth. If you didn't move your mouse or interact in some ways, they would assume that you were confused. And then Worldy would do something like knock on the window. Basically, he treated your computer screen like a window. You go, knock on the window. And whatever you were reading, you'd be like, you had no choice. You had to look at him. Or he would tap his foot. Or he would go, like that. He would yawn. And so we were doing usability tests. And people would get to the point where they figured out what the just about figured out what the gross domestic product of Kenya was. And suddenly Worldy would go, and then people would forget what they were doing. We killed Worldy just because it was so awful. But that is a conspicuous thing. That movement, you had no choice. And no matter how many iterations we went through, how many times people saw Worldy, they knew he was there, all that kind of stuff, they still paid attention to him every time. We couldn't help it. It was obligatory. Yes?
When designing things like that, interactive agents, how
Yep.
do you draw the line between agents that are actually useful versus the agents that are intrusive?
Yeah, I think it can be useful without being intrusive for sure. So for example, knowing it's there without it moving, for example, would be a good idea. So if it's there and you have to query it, for example, that's not a bad idea. So if you clicked on it or hit a button every time you needed to sort of summon it, that would be less intrusive than it kind of, than it kind of intruding and saying, hey, do you need help? Another thing you could do is do something that's a little bit less intrusive, but by making some movement that is just sort of small, maybe almost a little bit like this, maybe a little more subtle than this, but even if it was something like this where it bounced up once or twice to kind of let you know, remind you that it's there, that's not too bad. It's not terribly intrusive. But the more meaning it has, like yawning or tapping its foot or something, even though it's cute, the more ability it has to distract you. So just bouncing up and down sort of reminds you, but it doesn't add meaning.
Yeah, because I mean, if someone's yawning at you, it's
Oh,
pretty
yeah.
much saying you're taking forever, so it's
That's exactly
stressing you out.
the same thing with the foot tapping.
Yeah. You know, so whereas if something's just bouncing out, like you said, it's just gonna catch your attention. But
Exactly.
You need an update real quick.
Yep.
Whenever you're done.
Yep. Yes.
Just a side note, I guess. But I know my industry advisor this week.
Good.
I asked him, like, do you have any examples of like either really good or bad?
Yep.
Back with you experience? And he paused for like probably 10 seconds and was like, if it's good human factors, you don't really notice it.
That's really true. I think that's another. This is true in design in general, although some design, you really get a sense for it. But often, the times we notice design is when it's really awful. So often, if good designers are doing their job, and good human factors people are doing their job, you don't even notice them. Yeah, it's a really good point. And you might even argue that part of our job is to sort of make the user interface almost disappear, so that you're sort of interacting with the information or you're interacting with the task, but you're not interacting with the tool so much, or it doesn't feel like you are anyway. Okay, so I got to look and see how I'm doing on time. I didn't bring my watch today. We could probably get through a little bit more here. So here are the other things. This won't advance my slides. So here are other ways of making things conspicuous. Again, remember, anything that jumps out from its surroundings, anything that's different than its surroundings. So you can see things like, let's see. Well, you can't see the gray value differences up here because it's washed out. But here's one where all these things are the same except for this slight little difference, and our eyes are drawn to it automatically. these shapes really don't vary that much, except one is kind of triangular and that pops out. This one has a shadow, this one's filled, this one has an outer glow. Any number of things can be used to make something pop out. And this is one of the things that I mean by sort of the spirit of the design. Imagine you are a UX designer, a UI designer, and you create something and you come up with this. And that was going to be your way of making something pop out. And now imagine your software engineers come back to you and say, we can't do the glow effect. We just can't do it. I've been working for days on it. You would be like, hey, no big deal. You didn't need to work for days on this. You could do this instead. It could be filled. You could do the cast shadow. You can do any number of other things as long as you're sort of adhering to that sort of spirit of the design. And in fact, I've been amazed how many times people complain about software engineers and so forth. Oh, well, they tell me it can't be done. Lots of times, it's not that it can't be done, but it'll take them weeks when they didn't plan it. Lots of times, what they can do captures exactly the same thing, and it's just that you were missing communication. And then once you get to know them, once they start working, you start working together, they get it and you get it, and it's easier. Yeah, Dave?
So conspicuity looks to take advantage of parallel search patterns?
Well, absolutely. Yeah, so conspicuity does exactly that. You don't have to sort of look sort of linearly or serially. You don't have to examine each item. Instead, it sort of makes one pop out. You can sort of look at it as a whole or in parallel. Yep. So what are the things that make things look like they go together? And some people did some great work on this. Max Kohler was one of them. Let's see. I'll have to think about the other Gestalt psychologists. But this is a group that was interested in understanding perception. And one of the things they recognized is that we make a lot of simplifying assumptions when we look at patterns in the world. And these assumptions help us figure things out. So, for example, they noticed that lots of times we assume things close even though they might not. So that looks like a G even though it doesn't go all the way around. Things sort of continue even when they're interrupted. So this looks like an S even though it's got this stick going through it. These two things seem really similar to each other, so we could see that they're related, the T and the T. The figure in the ground is important to be able to detect. So for example, we see that as an A, but it's also a tree. So, do you see the tree? Yeah, look at that. So the whole idea is the Gestalt psychology principles come from the word of whole form in German. And the argument, or sort of the way of thinking about it, is the whole is more than just the sum of its parts. We tend to fill in some of the parts in between. And an example of that is when you look at your friend's face, really what you're seeing is a bunch of angles and reflections and things like that. That's the bottom-up information. But we don't see that. That is, we don't perceive that. We perceive our friend's face. So these are perceptual laws that attempt to explain how our minds automatically organize stimuli together. So here's one way of thinking about it. We have a tendency to see things that are ambiguous in a way that would be the most simplest explanation in the world. Okay? So in other words, we don't assume the most complex information or the most complex explanation. We go with the simplest. So if you look at, say, the Olympic rings here, we assume that they're overlapping rings, right? That they go, but it could just as easily be this. It just turns out that we always assume it's this. We always make the simplifying assumption, basically. And some principles enable us to make the simplifying assumption. So we see these 5 circles, not these 9 objects instead. So here's one example, the figure ground situation. everything we do, we try to figure out what's in front and what's behind it. That just helps us figure out depth and things like that. So we identify the main objects in the scene which stand out from the background. So here's an example. This is a vase that was donated to or given to Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. And we see it typically as a vase, right? It looks like that. But on the other hand, if you put it on a black background, you see one face here, which is him, and one face here, which is her. So we know, or we get the sense that the simplest thing is that this is just a vase. It's not him and her and some white thing in the background. It's got to be this white thing out front with that in the background. So that's what we mean by figure and ground. Another one is just plain old proximity. It's amazing how much just the slightest change in proximity matters to meaning, right? So these obviously are flickering lights. There's 10 of them. And this is, I don't even know what this is. What is it? What does that mean? Oh, okay.
It might be a type.
Okay, it must be, yeah, Pepsi Ape. Okay. But I'm thinking that's bad. That's not great marketing. But you can see just this proximity makes this thing, especially this one, really, really confusing. So if you just move this a little bit, right, over, we would have no problems with that at all. So proximity is incredibly strong. So I think what I will do is so next week is human factors. So I'm out next week, right?
No, it's the week after.
It's a week after. Good, thanks. So on Tuesday we'll finish up the rest of this, and then we'll start talking about cognition, which will include learning and memory and decision making and things like that. Okay, let's finish up now. Let's stop now, and I'm going to ask Alex and anybody else who would like to help me to go through the syllabus, and I'll send you an updated syllabus. In the meantime, I'll see you Tuesday.
I wouldn't even let her one.